Why did George Floyd die in the democratic system of America? George Floyd's death, which occurred on May 25, 2020, was a tragic event that sparked widespread outrage and protests against systemic racism and police brutality in America. While the incident itself took place within the jurisdiction of Minneapolis, Minnesota, rather than being directly attributable to the broader political system of the United States, it shed light on long-standing issues related to racial injustice and police violence that persist across the country. The circumstances surrounding George Floyd's death, specifically the actions of the police officers involved, prompted calls for accountability, systemic reforms, and a re-evaluation of law enforcement practices. The response to Floyd's death highlighted deep-seated issues within American society, including systemic racism, inequalities in the criminal justice system, and the need for meaningful change to address these issues. While George Floyd's death occurred within the context of a democratic system of governance, it serves as a stark reminder that systemic injustices and disparities persist, regardless of political affiliation. The movement for racial justice and police reform that emerged in response to Floyd's death underscores the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in America. The death of George Floyd was a tragic event that occurred within the United States, a country with a democratic system of government. However, it's important to note that the circumstances surrounding Floyd's death were not directly caused by the country's political system, but rather by actions taken by individuals within the criminal justice system. George Floyd died while being arrested by police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25, 2020. The widely circulated video footage of his arrest showed a white police officer kneeling on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, despite Floyd's pleas for help and his inability to breathe. Floyd's death was later ruled a homicide, and the officer who knelt on his neck, Derek Chauvin, was convicted of murder. The factors that led to George Floyd's death are complex and multifaceted, reflecting broader issues of systemic racism, police brutality, and inequalities within the criminal justice system. These issues have deep historical roots and are not exclusive to any particular political party or ideology. While the United States operates within a democratic framework with principles of freedom, equality, and justice enshrined in its founding documents, the reality is that systemic injustices persist and affect marginalized communities, including Black Americans. Floyd's death served as a catalyst for renewed calls for racial justice, police reform, and systemic change to address these deeply ingrained issues. Why was George Floyd killed in the racist system of America? George Floyd's killing on May 25, 2020, occurred within the context of systemic racism and long-standing issues of police brutality in America. While George Floyd's death was a tragic event, attributing it solely to the broader racist system oversimplifies the complexities of the situation. However, it is essential to recognize that systemic racism does play a significant role in shaping the experiences and outcomes of Black individuals within the United States, including encounters with law enforcement. The circumstances surrounding George Floyd's death, particularly the actions of the police officers involved, reflect broader patterns of racial bias and discrimination within the criminal justice system. Studies have consistently shown racial disparities in police practices, including higher rates of police stops, arrests, and the use of force against Black individuals compared to their white counterparts. Moreover, systemic racism extends beyond law enforcement to other areas of society, including housing, education, healthcare, employment, and more. These structural inequalities perpetuate systemic disadvantages for Black Americans and contribute to disproportionate rates of poverty, incarceration, and limited access to resources and opportunities. While George Floyd's death occurred within a country that aspires to democratic ideals of equality and justice for all, it exposed deep-seated issues of racial injustice and systemic racism that continue to plague American society. The widespread protests and calls for reform that followed Floyd's death underscored the urgent need to address these systemic injustices and work towards creating a more equitable and just society for all individuals, regardless of race or ethnicity. Why was George Floyd killed in the allegedly post-racist system of America? George Floyd's killing on May 25, 2020, tragically underscores that systemic racism and racial injustices persist in America despite efforts to address them. While some may characterize America as a post-racist society, the reality is that racial inequalities and biases continue to permeate various aspects of society, including law enforcement. The circumstances surrounding George Floyd's death, particularly the actions of the police officers involved, highlight the ongoing issues of police brutality and racial bias within the criminal justice system. Floyd's death was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a broader pattern of systemic racism that disproportionately impacts Black Americans. Despite legal and social advancements over the years, such as the civil rights movement and legislation aimed at combating racial discrimination, systemic racism persists in institutions, policies, and social structures. This systemic racism manifests in disparities in areas such as education, employment, healthcare, housing, and criminal justice, perpetuating inequalities and injustices for marginalized communities. The killing of George Floyd sparked widespread outrage and protests across the country, with many demanding accountability, systemic reforms, and an end to police brutality and racial injustice. The events following Floyd's death served as a powerful reminder that America has not yet achieved true racial equality and justice, and that significant work remains to be done to address systemic racism and create a more inclusive and equitable society for all individuals.